Yeah. Thank you all for coming. So this is panel 13, Modern Money, Payment Systems, and Digital Rights. I'm Amar Reganti. I'm going to be moderating this discussion. We have a great set of speakers here today, and we're going to start out with Carlos Mucha, but he's going to speak to us on legal foundations of payment instruments, technology. We have Daniela Gabor, who's going to speak to us on shadow finance. And of course, Rohan Grey is going to talk about the role of legal safety considerations and mobile money. And finally, Brett Scott, and the potential and limits of cryptocurrency. So, without much ado, let's go ahead and jump right into Carlos here. Right? Oh, sorry, I put the wrong one. Sorry, man.
Oh, no, for some reason it's saying, Interesting. We should repair. Yeah, I did presidential contour, so. Oh, here, maybe I can just go and.
Slight rules.
Sorry. Let me just. Is that off a second? Yeah. Sign into my email without everybody being able to watch. Sorry, guys. I'm just going to see, unless it's a problem with the PowerPoint presentation itself, it shouldn't be. It just might have been a problem with the. Can you do it? I think it might be a problem with the PowerPoint, Colin.
Yeah, I can go ahead. I do. Keep it when y'all wait.
Yeah, see, mine's working. Yeah, it's a problem with your PowerPoint.
Alrighty. Well, I was just good. I'll have to paint a picture with my words.
Conceptualize.
My name is Carlos Mucha. I am a lawyer down in Atlanta. And I first got involved in economics and in the MMT movement basically by hanging out at Warren Mosler's website. Gosh, 8 or 9 years now. And, we would just hash out all sorts of different economic questions, and we'd spitball strange questions to Warren, see how we tackle them, and he, it was just a really good discussion. You see that less now in blogs, and I guess now people go to Twitter to have their conversations. I guess it was in 2009 I came across a Wall Street Journal article. It's really interesting. And what it was about how frequent flyer miles, they're their own sort of fan cult. The frequent flyer aficionados, whatever they call themselves, they had figured out a really interesting way to score free miles. What they would, the U.S. Mint had a deal where you could buy state dollar coins. You could buy them with your credit card. So what they were doing is they were going in buying thousands, tens of thousands of dollars of dollar coins. The Mint was shipping it to their house, and they would go to their bank to deposit it, pay off their credit card bill, and they just netted all those frequent flyer miles. And that really struck me. And it was great for everyone but the airlines. I mean, the customers were getting free miles. The Mint makes 88 cents profit on every dollar coin it sells. And the person that gets the inflation was being shifted to the airline frequent flyer accounts, because they were just right. They had to stop it after they were losing millions of miles. They were given away for free. And so at some point on a conversation at Warren's site, we were talking about the debt limit. And in 2009, it was, or I guess it's early 2010, it was theoretical. I mean, why wouldn't Congress put the debt ceiling? And I started doing research, and I mentioned what I'd seen about the Mint. And I started researching, and it turns out that in '96, Phil Deal, who was Clinton's Mint director, he had gone to Congress with a bill to basically reform the Mint. And one of the elements was it allowed the Secretary of Treasury to issue any quantity of platinum coins of any denomination, completely at his discretion. And so at more inside, I mentioned, you know, there's no reason for the government to ever run out of money. And it really took off from there because it was a year later. And I don't know if you all have read the Shock Doctrine by Naomi Klein. And it's how political activists who basically want to destroy government, its capacity to serve the public purpose, they will wait for a natural disaster, a terrorist attack, something bad, because when people are in shock or psychologically weak, that's when you can move things through without public debate, things that otherwise are not passed. Well, in 2011 and again in 2013, and it'll really will continue until the debt limit is eliminated. We have a situation where people are inducing a crisis. I mean, that's taken it past. I mean, no one starts a hurricane. But there are members of Congress that figured out that if they could cause a financial crisis, they could get changes to the tax policy, spending policy of the country they would otherwise never get. And that's what was behind the fight. And I know you were in Treasury, so you can tell us what was going on the inside. But, you know, from the outside, it just seemed like that was a way that the Treasury would be able to keep on spending. And it was funny, as my blog, Monetary Realism, we're commenting about this, and then Phil Deal, who was Clinton's Mint director, chimed in and said, "You're absolutely right." So when I drafted it, we left it open, and no one thought it was what happened, but you can absolutely do it. And at that point, I pretty much decided to give up blogging, because that's kind of like peak blogging experience right there. You know, what's funny is the other way. You know, the Federal Reserve is interesting because it's like a fourth branch of government in a constitution that only has 3 branches. It really should be part of the executive branch, but it's not. It should be, from an accounting standpoint, I know MMT economists talk about how, think of a consolidated government and Fed. You know, legally, or financially it's not. I mean, on an accounting standpoint, they're kept separately. But, you know, gosh, must have been 6 years ago, the Federal Circuit Court of Appeals, and they handle, when someone sues the federal government for payment, hey, you didn't pay us for this ship we built or this concrete we delivered, you go to the Court of Claims, and then the Circuit Court's their appeals court. Well, someone sued the FDIC, well, someone had a claim against the FDIC, which, like the Fed, is a separate fourth branch entity, and the Circuit Court said, you know what? If you're doing a government function, you can sue Treasury directly. It changed 60 years of case law. So I don't know why. If someone had a claim against the Fed, they could go to the Court of Claims and make Treasury pay. And that's something that it's not consolidated, but it should be. The other way that Treasury could have gotten around the debt ceiling is that the Treasury Secretary has the authority to accept gifts from anyone. And the funds must be used to retire the public debt. The Federal Reserve owns, approximately $2 trillion. It was a little less back in 2011. I think it's $4 trillion now of Treasury bonds. If they had donated it back to the Treasury, that would have reduced the funds under the debt ceiling by that much. There's no legal, you know, the Fed's sort of fiduciary responsibility is to the Treasury. So to donate the funds back to their beneficiary, there's no legal, I mean, they're not cheating anyone. They're just giving the money back to the beneficiary. They already give the interest. Now they're giving the corpus of the fund. That was a way that I suggested, but it was the platinum coin idea that sort of caught people's imagination. You know, there was a discussion about, you know, how do you convince people, or how do you sort of get them to recognize the realities of, you know, we're not on a gold standard, there's no constraint. I don't know that you can. I practice law in Georgia, and I find myself in small town courtrooms a lot, and I found that it's easier to convince someone that you're on the same page with them than to get them to change their mind to agree with you. So I guess what MMT has to do is, how do you frame it so that you're agreeing with the values that they already believe in? I mean, for one example is that you hear this thing, oh, no family can deficit spend. I mean, the government needs to budget like a family. Well, very few families buy their house for cash. They get a mortgage and they amortize it over 30 years. The government doesn't do that. They'll spend $15 billion on an aircraft carrier that will be in service for 50 years, and they put all the costs on the years that it's built. They don't amortize it over time. So if the government really budgeted like a family, it would have a capital budget where the budgetary cost would be applied over years. In other words, I guess instead of saying deficits don't matter, it's what ways that I agree with what people already know can be used to reduce the deficit so that it's less of a factor. Because I think if you say, oh, deficits don't matter, we can spend, the only constraint is inflation, I think that's a lot of moving parts in people's heads. I think the biggest reduction in federal spending that's out there, and I'm sorry I don't have the graph to show you, is net interest. Over the next decade, we're slated to spend $5 trillion in interest. Basically, the government is paying interest to bondholders for its own money. And there are different ways to reduce that amount. I know Warren's as straightforward as anything. He said that the natural rate of interest is 0, and the Treasury should not issue anything more than 3-month T-bills. If the interest cost goes from $5 trillion to effectively 0, that's a lot of money that either to reduce the deficit or can be used for spending that you don't have to explain away, like, oh, we need to raise your taxes for health care, or we need these social programs. I think any way that can be used to fund government without raising taxes, I think that's the route to take before, I hate to say it, I think raising taxes is easier to explain than, oh, we can spend without deficits. But that's my opinion. I know that other folks need to speak, so I'll cut this short. Oh, I have time? Oh, okay.
If you could talk about the debt ceiling as an instrument class, I'd love to, that'd be awesome.
Well,
if you got some time.
I got some time. Until the First World War, any time that the government had to borrow, they had to go to Congress for a specific authorization for that bond issuance, which, considering they're issuing T-bills every week, it's impossible. So Congress didn't want to give up all the reins. So ever since 1917, I guess, they've been raising the debt ceiling every couple of years. It's crazy because they're the ones that set taxes, they're the ones that appropriate spending. That should be, it's not the Treasury's fault that they have to borrow money. It's Congress created this condition. But ever since then, it's just sort of been this ticking time bomb that I think it's nihilism. If someone wants to stop the government from functioning, they can hold that up. I know I think there's legislation, I can't remember the members offhand, I'm sorry, a couple of senators are about to sponsor a bill that would basically eliminate the debt ceiling. And, it's such an artificial problem. I mean, they really should. I mean, there's so many other issues that we need to be tackling. And I'm sure people who want to blow up the government are going to find other ways to create crises, but this is one that shouldn't be on the table. So this is something I'd be interested in hearing from you, is the Treasury's reaction to sort of ways of getting around the debt ceiling. I do know that the Federal Reserve was not happy because it would be a limitation of their power. What's interesting is, I guess that they updated there was an amendment to the Federal Reserve Act added in the 1920s that's basically is 31 USC 246, anyone who wants to look it up online. But essentially, it's wherever any power vested by this chapter, the Federal Reserve Act, in the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System appears to conflict with the powers of the Secretary of the Treasury, such powers shall be exercised subject to the supervision and control of the Secretary. Essentially, it's, in baseball, the tie goes to the runner. If there's a conflict between Treasury and the Federal Reserve, the tie goes to the Secretary. And I don't know if that was appreciated in the Treasury building. And not to, and there have been some exceptions to this rule, but I think a lot of the Treasury secretaries come from Wall Street, and they're kind of, that's their mindset, and so they could have a clean conscience, and they're doing their best, but you know, that's their sort of the box that they've been living in their whole careers. I mean, you look at the guys who've really haven't been afraid to sort of shake things up, like John Connolly, who ended the gold standard international transactions, or even James Baker, who tackled the trade deficit. You know, they were Texans from the oil patch who knew they were never going to work on Wall Street. And so I think that's one part of the government that is the sort of the intellectual capture of the people who get that job has really, I think, stopped them from addressing things in a different way. They could have. And I know out of the other panelists are talking about new ways of technology and use of, I should say Bitcoin, I guess it's like blockchain technology as a way to basically move banking from the banks to cell phone companies and other sort of unique ways of providing banking services to people. And Rohan has written a great paper on it I'd like to hear talk about. And I really think that it's kind of like changing the banking system isn't going to come from the banks. It's going to be coming from people outside that are eating they're going to eat their lunch. And that's all I have for you.
I'll address those things you brought up at the end after we've had a chance to get all the panelists through.
Sure. Thanks.
Are you taking questions now? Or?
No, we're going right to you.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Can you hear me without the microphone? Is that okay? Okay. I'm going to talk to you today about plumbing, about financial plumbing. It's not an MMT story, but it is in the spirit of the MMT in the sense that there are balance sheets involved. So I will play with balance sheets a little bit. This sort of question about shadow money comes from a context of the rise of shadow banking as something to be interested in analytically. Shadow banking has been defined since 2008 as the production and financing of tradable securities. And this is interesting theoretically, but also empirically, because the Financial Stability Board has identified shadow banking as the key root of the global financial crisis, and it set out since 2011 to create a set of rules in order to regulate it better, right? So the context has become more interesting for this question of shadow money, because the FSB agenda since 2014 has changed from regulating fragile shadow banking into creating a resilient securities markets-based financial system, not only in the US, but across the globe, right? So this is a kind of problematic or context in which to which I'm going to speak today. And the main question that I'm going to address is, what does money mean in securities-based financial systems? In other words, if we were to design or to think about a monetary theory of shadow banking, what would it look like? Okay, so what does money mean in securities-based financial systems? And if you want to have a look, there we have it's a project that is funded by INET, and I'm doing it with a colleague, Jakob Vestergaard, and you can find more information. If the 15 minutes today don't make any sense to you, go on the website, and in writing probably we're better. So what is the sort of main idea of the project? The main argument is that to compare bank money, right, and shadow money. This is the starting point for our definition, and we argue bank money in the sort of standard post-Keynesian framework that MMT also belongs to. Bank money arises from credit creation via relationship banking. A loan makes a deposit, and it funds assets held to maturity on the balance sheet of banks, right? In contrast, we define shadow money as that arises from credit creation through capital markets or securities markets, and it funds securities continuously repriced via repo transactions. And I'll define repos in a second. And this is building on a literature that comes from Perry Merling, Zoltan Poshar, and some lawyers who have also started to engage with it, particularly Nadav Pierre. So shadow money is about credit creation through securities markets. It funds securities continuously repriced, and we argue are functional to a capitalist system where in finance you have business models reliant on daily variation in the market price of securities. So very important, daily variation in the market price of securities. Okay, so where do we start from? When I make presentations about shadow money and what we mean by, people say, well, the only money that is worth talking about theoretically is the money that can buy you a burger, okay? Well, that unfortunately doesn't leave a lot of space for actually discussing new forms of money. So I want to remind you that when Keynes wrote the Treatise on Money in the 1930s, he distinguished between proper money that extinguishes debt and bank money that acknowledges debt. So in the 1930s, we didn't think of bank deposits as proper money. We do today. And if that's the case, then it means that in the future, some things or some liabilities that we don't think are proper money now may become proper money. So you might be able to pay for a burger in the future with a repo. I'm still trying to work out in my head what that would mean, but you know, financial innovation is always there to help. So, where do we draw from theoretically? We draw from Hyman Minsky, obviously. And Hyman Minsky, he was very interested in new monetary liabilities that appear or are created by financial institutions in capitalism in order to economize on the existing forms of money, right? And this is an older idea in monetary theory that I'm going to come back to. Not all new monetary liabilities or new promises to pay are created equally, and they don't all become money. And Stephanie Kelton has written a really interesting paper in 2002 where she argues that we need to think about these new monetary liabilities as part of a hierarchical system of money. And this hierarchy of new promises to pay or new monetary liabilities is ordered by their general acceptability. The more people start to accept and use a new promise to pay, the more it becomes generally acceptable. What is at the core of this general acceptability, we argue, is whether you can convert at par and on demand. What does it mean? For example, you can convert a bank deposit at par into US dollars, right? For each dollar of bank deposits, you will get a dollar of cash. How do we get to this convertibility? Well, depending on who you read, if you go by a very narrow chartalist definition, the idea is you get par convertibility the moment that the state says, I'll take those promises to pay in order to discharge your tax liability. And I am going to say that I don't think this explanation goes far enough, knowing where I am. But chartalism is not enough of a story to explain how some new forms of money become proper money. What we need also to recognize is that although even if the state says I'm going to accept bank deposits as a form of money, it's not enough because we do get recurrent financial crises, right? We do get runs on bank deposits and we do get runs on banks. And I think it's more helpful to think about the idea of par convertibility through a social contract around money. In other words, you need the state to say, I'm going to help the issuers of money to preserve their promise to pay at par, right? And this is, there is an argument looking at monetary history that the reason why we treat bank money as money today is because the state says, I'm going to guarantee bank deposits, I'm going to give you lender of last resort, and in return, I'm going to ask that you accept regulation, and that's why we have bank regulation. I'm going to work with monetary policy, and I'm going to restrict your ability to issue new bank deposits, right? So that's very important, this idea that there has to be a relationship between the state and money issuing institutions in order to preserve the par convertibility, because from that relationship, the money issuing institutions want to run away, right? They want to run away from that relationship because it imposes certain constraints on that. So we can think about capitalism as having a fundamental tendency to innovate new liabilities that promise a par without state support, because state support is expensive and constraining. So very important, the fundamental tendency in capitalism to innovate new liability that promise par without state support. And I'm going to show you why shadow money is a perfect example of this innovation. It's not new. I discovered it was around in the 19th century here in the US before the creation of the Federal Reserve. But it's a promise to pay at par without state support. And to illustrate that, I'm going to show you some balance sheets. I have 20 minutes, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time discussing what are assets and liabilities. I'm sorry for those. I'm assuming in an MMT crowd everybody can follow it. And also, kind of excuse me for using Salomon Brothers and BlackRock. I don't think they were actually in the same space at the same time, but they are useful as an example. So in this example, Salomon Brothers is a securities dealer, right? It used to be a primary dealer in the government bond market here in the US. And it wants to borrow, it's a securities dealer that wants to borrow from a cash investor, BlackRock. So it wants to borrow that deposit. How does it do it? Through a repo or a repurchase agreement. It says, I'm going to use some of the sovereign bonds or government bonds that I have in order to borrow that deposit. And I'm going to sell those government bonds, get paid with a deposit, right? And in order to account for this sale, I'm going to issue a repo, right? And why do I have a repo there? Because a repo stands for a repurchase agreement. So when Salomon Brothers sells the sovereign bonds, it also commits to buy them back at a later point in time, right? So this is what the transaction looks like. Salomon Brothers has borrowed from BlackRock through a repo that is a promise to pay back by government collateral. Why does Salomon Brothers want that? Because then he can buy some mortgage-backed securities, right? So what we have in this transaction, we have credit creation through securities markets, in this case, a mortgage-backed security, funded with a wholesale funding instrument with what we call shadow money, a repo transaction that is secured by a government collateral. Why is it that this is a particularly useful instrument to create a par promise without the state there? Well, because the repo transaction is structured to have a difference between the legal and the economic treatment, right? So in legal terms, Salomon Brothers sells the security to BlackRock and promises to buy it back. In economic terms, Salomon Brothers just borrows a deposit, borrows means of payment from BlackRock, and remains the economic owner of these government securities. So very important, it remains the economic owner. In other words, it is the one that has the risks and returns on the collateral that it has pledged to BlackRock. Why does BlackRock want to become the legal owner? Because it can sell these securities during crisis. So it doesn't worry so much about counterparty risk anymore. It worries about, we'll see in a second, it worries about what happens to the price of these US treasuries. Why is this promise to pay in a repo so strong? Well, it's strong because on any day in the life of this repo, both Salomon Brothers and BlackRock calculate the market value of the collateral that was moved from one institution to the other in order to make sure that there is 100 of US treasuries for the 100 of bank deposits that need to be returned at a future point in time. If the market price of collateral changes, for example, it increases to 110, BlackRock has the obligation to send back Salomon Brothers the 10, right? So you have this par convertibility from a specific legal institutional mechanism that has to do with collateral valuation, right? So very important, there is a collateral valuation mechanism that preserves par. And with that, then, if we start to think about this idea that shadow money allows for a private par promise that depends on collateral, then we start to think about the whole range of financial institutions that are involved in the process of shadow money creation, either as issuers or as holders. In my example, I had leveraged funds who also benefit. Salomon Brothers benefits from the increase in the price of security. So you can see a link between asset prices and leverage. Because the more these U.S. treasuries increase in price, the more margin calls it can make, the more collateral it receives in return, so it can grow the balance sheet further and further. It's also important for institutional investors and asset managers because they can do cash lending via repos. They can also swap their portfolio of securities. If they have U.S. treasuries, they can swap them with a levered fund for other types of securities. It's also important in Europe for market-based banks, the ones that do proprietary trading and they do market making in securities markets. It's important for broker-dealers who, I could have shown in the previous example, if Salomon Brothers could have chosen not to borrow mortgage-backed securities, but to lend those deposits onwards to somebody else who wanted to buy securities, and it would have done a matchbook repo. And I'm learning nowadays that fintech is also starting to experiment with repos. I don't understand exactly how that works, but it's there. With this idea in mind, right, that this shadow money is about business models anchored in daily variation in the price of securities, we can derive 4 propositions about shadow money. The first one I have explained. This is money. It has the attribute of moneyness because there is continuous repricing of collateral that preserves par. There is a broader range of institutions that create shadow money, and very important for the title of our panel that has to do with settlement. All this money creation occurs because of settlement through the balance sheet of either a bank or the central bank. And I'll show you why the settlement becomes analytically important. There are questions of endogeneity. In other words, with this framework, we can start to update our endogenous money story in post-Keynesianism with securities dealers markets. And of course, then there are crises. And any crisis of money are crises of par, right? And in this case, we have pressures on par convertibility that have to do with the disappearance or the evaporation of market liquidity in particular securities markets. And some people argue Lehman was a crisis of shadow money. I have argued with colleagues somewhere else that the European sovereign debt crisis was a crisis of shadow money rather than a crisis of Greeks misbehaving. I'm going to focus on all these propositions. It's impossible to do them in 50 minutes. I'm going to focus on the second one to discuss settlement and the US shadow money system. We have with shadow money a broader range of institutions that can create money. However, they don't create money without resorting to the balance sheet of either a clearing bank or the US Federal Reserve. In my example, I'm not going to subject you to all the explanation of this, but in my example of Salomon Brothers and BlackRock, in order for Salomon Brothers and BlackRock to actually do this transaction, they need to go to their own clearing banks, and manufacturer Hanover was actually the clearing bank of Salomon. And these clearing banks in return have to go through the balance sheet of the central bank because they need to send bank deposits from one to the other, and they need to move securities from one securities clearing account to the other. Why does this matter? It matters because then we can start to think about temporality and money. And of course, for those of you who are familiar with Keynes, we've always thought about money and time, and typically how we think about money and time, we think about it in terms of money being something that connects an irreversible past to an uncertain future, right? This is why we have liquidity preference. However, with shadow money, the story gets more complicated because you have both cash or bank deposits and securities that move across the balance sheets of private and public institutions. In other words, the temporality, this kind of broad story of temporality of money as a time machine that connects the past and the future becomes more complicated due to the fact that there are these daily variations in the price of collateral and because there are settlement flows moving around. How do I make sense of that? Well, we argue that we have to think about the time of money. And what do I mean by the time of money? I mean the way in which both state institutions and private institutions choose to order time on their balance sheet. And to give you an example, the central bank can, for example, order time in real-time gross settlement that says you have to, whenever a bank pays another bank, it has to go and pay through the balance sheet of the central bank and make the payment immediately in gross terms as opposed to netting at the end of the day. So that's very important. How the central bank chooses to order time may come into conflict with how securities dealers choose to order time. In other words, with the temporal demands of securities trading, market making, and settlement. And there are the researchers I think at the Philadelphia Fed that are discussing now the concept of time-critical liquidity. That is that you have to deliver security or cash at a particular point in time, and windows of time are no longer of days or weeks, but they are of minutes and seconds. Why does this make? Why is this important as a story? Because I think we think about settlement and these conflicts about time and how we order time on balance sheets, we can have an account of historical account of the emergence of the three-party repo market in the U.S. Right? What's that story? In the 1980s and 1990s. While Paul Volcker was trying to reduce inflation through sort of monetarist means, he and the Fed in general started to notice that a lot of the movements intraday that come from real-time gross settlement, a lot of the movements intraday in the balance sheet of the Fed were coming not from retail payments between banks, but from the positions of the clearing banks of securities dealers. Because what the dealers were doing, they were funding overnight their securities portfolios, they were funding them overnight through repos. They were unwinding in the morning and rewinding in the evening again, right? So intraday, it was the Fed who had to fund the securities portfolios because it was the only way in which securities dealers could have access to their portfolios of securities for market making. And the Fed looked at this picture, so that's up to 1994, and you see the red line increasing very quickly compared to the green line that has to do with movements in Fed wire funds. And the Fed looked at this picture and said, well, if I'm a monetarist Federal Reserve, I want to constrain the amount of reserves in the system in order to constrain the expansion in the money supply and then inflation. I can't have these large intraday positions that are blowing up my balance sheet. So what am I going to do about it? The Fed said, I'm going to put a charge for an intraday overdraft. Right? So they said, okay, if you want this balance sheet to grow intraday, it's very fine, but you have to pay for it. And the Salomon Brothers, this is why I kept it as an example, the Salomon Brothers came up with a very clever idea and said, well, let's not go to the Fed then, if the Fed is going to fund us, but rather convince manufacturers Hanover, our clearing bank, to take on its own balance sheet the movement of cash and collateral, right? And what we saw within this process is an increasing concentration in the three-party repo segment. And in the three-party repo, for example, by 2008, we only had JP Morgan and Bonnie Mellon. In the three-party repo, what these two, JP Morgan and Bonnie Mellon, do, they act as agents for Salomon Brothers and BlackRock, and they simply move securities and bank deposits from one account to the other on their own balance sheet instead of going to the Fed. Of course, this didn't solve the problem that the Fed had in the first place, because it now was JP Morgan and Bonnie Mellon that were unwinding in the morning and rewinding in the evening, right? So throughout the day, these very small banks were actually exposed or had very significant exposures, 2.8 trillion intraday credit, that allowed for shadow money to operate without the control of the state, right? Of course, now that's gone. The Federal Reserve and the Treasury said, well, I don't think that's a very good idea. And the solution that they came up with is to say, well, if the reason why you're doing intraday unwinding is because you want securities dealers to have access to their own securities, then we have to use the magic of the internet. I'm going to say it, that's sounding like I'm 8 years old. We have to use the magic of computers in order to make sure that we can create an algorithm that allows collateral substitution. In other words, you can go to the three-party repo agent and put collateral in and take it out without having to unwind. This is something that in Europe has been the case for the last 20 years. Right? More interest, so going back, this is a story of why time and settlement matters, because you see the settlement process is where the state and private institutions fight over how to order time on their balance sheets. can create a very interesting and fragile institutional structure for shadow money. I'm going to take a step back and say, after 2008, this was not the only thing that happened to shadow money, but what we are seeing now is a new social contract for the issuance of shadow money. In other words, the state is already redefining its relationship with shadow money issuing or holding banks. There are several examples of that. The US Federal Reserve is now taking some shadow banks on its own balance sheet by offering the reverse repo facility. Then we have the Basel III rules, which are asking global banks back into the balance sheet of the sovereign, either by asking them to hold high-quality liquid assets in the liquidity coverage ratio. We also have new rules imposed by the FSB that are trying to curtail the issuance of shadow money because there is a very clear link between shadow money and leverage. But all this has been resisted, and the new Trump administration here has been very explicit that they want to take away some of the pressures on and regulation on the repo market. But there are more sort of private sector solutions that are coming, and this is connected to what the next two speakers are talking about. A fintech solution to go back to the way that things were before 2008, that is to be able to economize on the sovereign liabilities again in the same way that the three-party repo was economizing on the sovereign's liabilities before 2008. And this comes from the increasing integration of capital and foreign exchange markets that creates the same intraday liquidity requirements that we saw for the three-party repo market in the US. It creates it for global banks that are active in different currency markets across the globe. And in order to be able to do their transactions, they have intraday liquidity and collateral requirements. And the solution from the fintech sector has been to create, or they are working now, Bonnie Mellon is one of them, to create a utility settlement coin. And you can see the utility settlement coin makes the same promises that are that I discussed at the beginning. I'm finished now. That I discussed at the beginning of my presentation, that if capitalism is about creating new promises to pay that promise at par without state control, we see the same one here. The utility settlement coin will be an asset-backed digital cash instrument that will be convertible at parity with a bank deposit in a corresponding currency and fully backed by cash assets held at the central bank. It's very interesting and to my mind quite extraordinary, because it somehow suggests that you could get parity in each different currency, although the exchange rates are not par. I'm not sure how this is going to work, but this is the future. And the idea is that the spending a utility settlement coin will be spending a paired real world currency, but obviously the ambition is to go again beyond the power, the balance sheet of now several sovereigns. Okay, I'm going to finish quickly with new questions. So, yeah, just to say I'm writing a book about this. I don't know if all these questions are going to be addressed, because looking at financial plumbing is always work in progress, since the plumbing is changing so quickly. But we have seen reforms of derivative markets and CCPs that are bringing the same practices of continuous repricing, and these are connected to the reform of money market funds that were very important in the ecology of shadow money in the US in particular. Then there are very difficult questions of monetary policy. And what do we mean by quantitative tightening in a system that has shadow money, where collateral is provided by the Treasury, right? The second question is the link between monetary policy and macroprudential policy, which is something that we discuss in macro, is becoming much more complicated if sovereign debt that is at the basis of a pyramid of shadow money, because it's the most liquid collateral. If sovereign debt issuance has financial stability implications, what do we do about that? Very important now, the Federal Reserve is changing the way that it's implementing monetary policy to target a secured overnight funding rate, which is a repo rate on Treasury's collateral. And we have to start asking questions, sort of more empirical questions, of what is the link between the interest rate on overnight repos and credit creation through the shadow banking sector. Finally, fintech, blockchain, and digital currencies. Thank you.
And Brian, you're next.
Cool. Can I use the mic?
Hello? Cool. Okay, thanks. I'm sorry, I'm going to use the mic. I had too much fun last night. My voice is dead. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. One of the luxuries of creating your own panel is you get to sit next to people you really like and respect. Carlos is one of my favorite lawyers of all time. The way that he thinks about money as a lawyer is an inspiration to me. Daniela's work, the first time I read it, made my head hurt, which is always a good sign that I'm learning something. Brett has had one of the most interesting sort of lives as a financial sort of thinker and person that I've ever come across. And Amar's the kind of person that while we all sit and talk about it, actually just goes and gets in the room and does it. So it's an absolute pleasure to be here with all these people. So I'm going to talk about banking under a digital fiat currency regime. I'm from the Modern Money Network. You may have heard of us. Cool. And that term, modern money, comes from a quote by Keynes in the Treatise of Money, where he observes that the state plays a central role as the authority of law, etc., etc. But it's notable that he's talking modern there in the context of 4,000 years. So we're not talking about a universal theory of money. There could be Martian money, there could be money, in hunter-gatherer societies that function differently, but we're talking about money in, advanced civilizations with complex social structures that go beyond face-to-face communication, that have a rule of law and a system of institutions that underpin those societies. So in that sense, we are talking about a temporal theory of money. This is a theory of one kind of money. It just happens to be the one that humanity's been in for about 4,000 years. It doesn't look like it's leaving anytime soon. So in that context, what does it mean to think about the next century? Because there are things that we are doing as a species that we have never done before. We're building a central nervous system for the human race called the internet, and we're communicating in ways that we've never communicated before, both with the concept of hypertext that changes our linguistic brain structures and in the way that we can create new forms of affinity in social networks that go beyond the geographic boundaries that have historically constrained the development of civilization. So what does it mean? Well, it's notable that money is obviously, as this conference is about, not just a veil for underlying economic activity, but is something that can be made to function in a range of different ways, positive and negative, depending on how you set it up. So the question of design becomes very important. And as Daniela has shown in her writing, we haven't done a particularly clear job of designing a monetary system or working out exactly what all these different things are supposed to be doing from the perspective of public purpose, which is one of the reasons why every time you try to understand the system, you end up going cross-eyed. Morgan Ricks, who is a lawyer who was at Treasury, is now a law professor at Vanderbilt, wrote a whole book saying that, really shadow banking, and I think this is consistent with other people's views here, really the whole issue of shadow banking can be thought of as an issue of monetary design. We designed a kind of imperfect or not functionally very well system, and this is the result. They say in law, hard cases make bad law. Well, hard monetary questions make bad monetary systems. So Joseph Summer, who is a lawyer at the Federal Reserve Bank, he's a kind of technologically focused person. He's written some interesting stuff on cyber law and other things. This is a different framing. I obviously am here because I believe in MMT. I think the legal and the economic side of what money is important, but temporality matters as well. There is a difference between the sort of chattel money that existed in Mesopotamia and the kind of money that exists today. And that is a question of technology and the development of social structures. So looking at the contemporary financial ecosystem, there's a lot going on. And why it's going on and what it's actually trying to do are questions that most people aren't spending time thinking about, even people who are thinking about money. And without any disrespect to anybody, myself, I count myself as one of these people. It's hard to think about technology when you're not a technologist. It's hard to, when you can't even get your email working very well, to think about the plumbing of the internet as well as the plumbing of the financial system is a pretty big burden to take on. The thing is that I want to talk about today is that this is also the case with public finance. This isn't simply a matter of shadow banking, although obviously Daniela's work is incredibly important in mapping that out. But as Carlos pointed out, the public financial system is a complex ecosystem mess. The Department of Education issues student debt that's collateralized and securitized, is engaging in its own form of shadow money. If the Treasury, as Daniela says, is a shadow central bank, then so is the Department of Education. And these entities are not talking to each other in the way that we really would like them to be doing. But rather than beating our head against the wall, maybe the answer is to sort of get ahead of this curve and to change the narrative on our own terms. So what I'm interested in is digital fiat currency, because nothing is hotter than saying fine tech, fine tech, fine tech all over the place, but also because you can have conversations when you wrap it in technology that you otherwise can't have. So people being willing to talk about things at central banks and reconsider fundamental structural design questions that they otherwise had no interest in talking about because somebody added the word tech to the end of that conversation. I'm interested in a digital fiat currency dollar. That is to say, a unit that can be a digital token that works across payments networks. It, like other forms of chattel or fiat money, is government issued, it can be legal tender, it's tax acceptable. The principal is guaranteed, but like with the reserve account system that we have now, it can pay positive interest. I don't want it to pay negative interest, and we can talk about that in the comments. I think there are real problems with that. And the other thing that it is going to be super convertible. This is my new little term, although Nathan Tankus was the one who suggested I use it, so I guess I'll give him credit, but I'm going to take it now. And lastly, and this is also important, I'll get into it, it could be a bearer instrument or a registered account instrument. And what I mean by that is, it could be a thing you hold in your hand, like Jan Krager was talking last night, and can be current, so whoever's holding it could be the person that could be considered an ownership. Or it could also be put into a registered account system where there is a flow network that you can trace and say, actually, we do know where it came from. It does have memory, and we are going to follow that around. So both of those systems will be able to function with digital fiat currency. Now, before we get into how it's going to look, I just want to draw some comparisons to get you to start thinking in these terms and how this might work. The first is, think about coins and think about central bank notes, the greenbacks in your pocket. Right? They're both physical tokens. They're issued by different agencies. And Carlos's talk and his amazing insight about the platinum coin, to get a blogosphere comment all the way up to the White House on the issue that Obama described as the most important of his presidency is a pretty amazing moment for internet activism and or just being really cool and smart. So kudos, mate. But it matters that the accounting treatment within the government is different for these two, and that's where the action was on this exact question, because the mint could get that profit, sweep it into the treasury, and bypass the need to go through the Federal Reserve System, which most people normally think is the only way that it can finance. So the mint is the sort of ugly younger sister that never gets talked about in the stories of the various government agencies that are engaged in financing. It's the sort of agency with the most power that no one's ever heard of or forgot about, because it sounds like something from a Charles Dickens novel, whereas the central bank sounds like something from the future. So they're both safe, they both have zero interest in maturity, they're both bearer instruments, and they both can be converted into other kinds of government liabilities if you want to. They're not convertible into gold, so let's clarify that word. Another example, and this one's maybe one that we don't spend as much time talking about, but I'd like to start talking about more, which is central bank securities. The IMF did a report in 2015 talking about the fact that about 35% of central banks in the world issue central bank securities of different maturities. Now, what is a central bank security? Well, they're both book entry, that is to say they're not physical pieces of paper anymore. One, they're issued by different agencies, and that makes all the difference. They're both safe and they can have positive interest in maturity. They're both marketable instruments, and they're both convertible through indirect ways, through central bank guarantees of secondary treasury markets and things like that, or just direct guarantees if you want to, depending on what institutional structure you have. So super convertibility is the idea that we can think of all of these instruments as special categories of a general class of government liability. But what you need to have for that to work is a sort of central thing through which all of these different assets can be traded into or out of. So in the same way as when the central bank says we're going to stand to buy treasury securities at X price and sell it at Y price, suddenly you have a convertibility between reserves and treasury securities. What if we just said any government guaranteed instrument can be converted against each other, right? And we're going to have an exchange system that enables you to see all of these instruments, whether it's a tax credit, whether it's a student-backed debt, whether it's a coin, whether it's a central bank-issued security or something, but acknowledging that from the perspective of the government, all of these things involve the same economic liability. They're all forms of, essentially, relief from some form of legal liability from the state, or can be used as an asset that's considered safe. The question then becomes, okay, so what are we going to design? We can design a system where you have a registered account where every transaction is monitored by the institution that controls the whole thing. So that is to say, it's like having a bookie where everything that goes on is recorded on that book and the bookie knows everything. Or you can have a bearer instrument where it's in your pocket, and you and I can meet behind this building and make some transaction, out of the realm of a security camera, and no one will ever know what's going on, other than the fact that there are a certain number of these instruments outstanding. That's the only information that the issuer knows, is that it issued them, it got sent out into the world, and it hopes it's having a fun time and doesn't end up with too much cocaine on it by the end. So there are two visions of digital fiat currency that I think of. One is this idea of a registered instrument, so you have a visible ledger, right? Everything goes through a single account. You can come up with intermediaries within that system, you can still have credit systems going on within that, but essentially there is a single unified master balance sheet in the sky, and as much as possible you're putting all transactions on that balance sheet. This actually kind of exists in a proto form in Ecuador. They started giving individual citizens central bank accounts, which up until then, the closest story you could tell of that was the Bank of England giving its own staffer accounts, which must have been a good thing because they wouldn't give it to anybody else, but they'll give it to themselves. But Ecuador has given every citizen an account attached to their mobile phone and said you can use it to pay taxes, you can use it to make transfers and things. So it's like Venmo, but Venmo isn't taking your data, monitoring you, and trying to make a profit off you. It's just a public infrastructure service. The thing I'm more interested in is an invisible ledger. This is an idea where the government, like with cash, sends a bunch of these digital files out that are cryptographically secure. They function across a wallet network that has a common protocol in the same way as you can come up with an email server, Gmail can come up with an email server, whatever, and they talk to each other via common standards. So these wallets talk to each other, but from the central bank's perspective, all it knows is that it issued a certain amount. It doesn't want to know, it doesn't ask, it's baked into the structure that this is not information that the issuer should be knowing. This is the model of a technology called e-currency by a for-profit company called e-currency Mint that I've been consulting with, writing some of their white papers because they're the only entity I've come across that has come close to a viable technological model for this vision. They have been working with about 20 central banks around the world doing testing of this behind the scenes. They rolled out at the beginning of this year in Senegal. They're rolling out to the whole West African Monetary Union in the next few years. They work with the Reserve Bank of India, China, US. They're serious players and they're seriously making this happen. And they've got the sort of technological special sauce to make this as a viable proof of concept from the software design. So the idea there is essentially that this would do what coins and cash do. So you aren't it's an endogenous supply that goes in reaction to bank deposits and everything else. If you want to convert into this, you can. If you want to convert out of it, you can. But that it essentially functions as a new kind of government instrument that bridges the gap between the fact that we do things digitally now and the fact that cash is still kind of an important concept in contrast to registered account instruments. That doesn't mean that you might not have legal restrictions on top of that. I can't take more than $10,000 of cash on a plane, for example, but that's not because cash is stopping me, right? It's not like when I have $10,001, that last dollar disintegrates or sort of jumps off the pile. It's because there's a law and there's a police force that's going to monitor me. But it is important structurally that the technology itself is dumb. I could have $1 million of cash on a plane, right? Cash isn't going to complain. So having a wallet network where the technology layer is dumb and then putting legal restrictions on top of that is very different to constructing a technological system where surveillance and control is baked into the DNA of the infrastructure. And that's one thing that's very important to focus on. And Brett hopefully will be talking some degree about that at his keynote this evening. So, last thing is what happens with banking in this world. Right? MMT acknowledges and Minsky acknowledges anyone can create money, but as Daniela pointed out, obviously the connection to the larger institutional structure of the state and of public backing is incredibly important. And I think, and I don't want to speak for Daniela, but my vision of this, a la Minsky, is we have to lean in to this. You can't continue to say it is not acceptable for private entities to create money, because as Daniela said, this is a fundamental feature of capitalism. It's like complaining about the weather or complaining about human nature. You just have to start from the realization that this is how it works and then work out how to deal with that problem. So the question is, if we have a system where people are going to be trying to create at-par convertible claims without state support, and that's going to cause systemically destabilizing roles, one solution to that, and it might not be complete or perfect, is to provide that support at the outset. And say, every time you start doing something close to this, we're going to provide that support in exchange for the kinds of regulation and supervision that they resist. So if you want to be a player in this game, and this is sort of Morgan Riggs's argument, You are going to be regulated and treated like you're engaging in publicly valuable activity and subject to public oversight. This isn't something you get to just do as a matter of personal freedom on your motorbike. You know, this isn't a First Amendment issue. This is a matter of you're engaging in activities that have social implications and therefore you should be socially accountable. So, once you have a digital fiat currency system, you don't need a bank deposit system for payments and for basic settlement processes. You don't need private entities to create safe assets. You can provide as many safe assets as you need, and people like Zoltan Pozar have been advocating for a floating treasury facility to ensure that there's enough safe collateral in the financial system so that you're not going to private actors to find near substitutes. Oh, sorry. But you still don't have credit, right? And we know that banks create credit endogenously, but that's also a process of expanding new kinds of instruments. Right, okay. And that ultimately this ends up being implicitly or explicitly backed by the central bank. So we're already in a world where banks accept loans and make deposits. But those deposits are themselves government-backed. So we're in a system now where we have a banking franchise system, as Robert Hockett and Sally Omarova would say, where they are acting as implicit agents of the government engaging in capital allocation and creation in the pursuit of industrial development. I don't think they need to be for profit. Let's make them public. It's fine with me. But the point is that this is an important public function for industrial development. In the old approach, or under the current approach, as you know, I'm getting my balance sheets out now, you would create a deposit liability at the bank, which I get to hold in my account. Lovely, good, I got my money. The bank holds my mortgage. And then if it needs to, at a certain point, if it, for settlement reasons, get additional reserves, it can always pledge that loan as collateral at the central bank and get reserves. And the central bank will accept that loan, accept that collateral because the bank had to have good enough collateral to meet its banking standards. The fact that this was a loan that it was legally able to make is proof that it satisfied the conditions for that to be good enough collateral for the central bank to accept. So by definition, this is good collateral to the central bank. What I want to talk about is a world where, instead of creating its own liability, it's explicitly an agent of the central bank. It explicitly gets to advance central bank liabilities. We skip that intermediary step, but at the same time, we require that collateral to be immediately pledged. And so as a result, the loan is not being made to distribute. There's no originate to distribute model because they can't distribute it. The thing that they have to do is immediately pledge that asset at the central bank in exchange for a full value face amount of that currency. So we are explicitly monetizing collateral from step one in the process rather than at the end of the process and dealing with that intermediary cost. Now, this is not the same as full reserve banking because you are not eliminating the ability to create credit. What this is doing is saying, we could create unlimited deposit insurance, but it's also kind of redundant and ugly and messy to have two tiers of a payment system when we don't need to, and it obscures that public franchise implication of the bank credit extension. So it's effectively making unlimited deposit insurance, but it's saying that the bank's job is to underwrite and to assess the credit quality of lenders. That's the special sauce, that's its unique value add in the system, is it's the one that looks you in the eye and says, are you a good credit risk? Yes, no, I'm going to make that call. And that's what being a licensed bank is about. The asset side discipline says, if you're pledging every single asset at the central bank, we're going to know what kind of loans you're making. If they're crappy liar's loans, we're going to see it, and it's going to be on us to make sure that you don't continue to engage in those kinds of loans. Right? But you have the system where, as long as the interest rate on those overdrafts is low enough, make it zero, I'm happy to advocate permanent zero on the record, as long as it's low enough, it's no additional cost to the current system. Most people talk about a full reserve system being more expensive in liquidity costs because they're thinking of having to pay a positive rate on that liquidity. If the liquidity is free, there's no cost. So this is not going to have any impact on the amount of bank lending in the sense that it's going to constrain credit or anything. It's simply going to make more explicit the underlying public nature of the activity and give a more clear, simple system that people can understand, to go to Carlos's point, right, than we otherwise have. Now, there are challenges from this. One is that it going to make more clear to people that there is an inherent trade-off between public credit and private credit and public investment when you're dealing with questions of real resource allocation. So, as I like to say, it doesn't matter. Most people don't care if a casino doesn't get funded that would have liked to have been funded. Nobody weeps for the bank loan that wasn't made. So if you're in a system where you want to create some more public spending and someone says we've hit real resource constraints, you say, but wait a second, that casino's about to get a $500 million loan. If we can create $500 million for that casino over there, are we at our real resource constraints, or are we just prioritizing that casino loan over the next public investment we want to make? Now, and funnily enough, I was just talking about this outside with Jan Kregel, when you had the arguments over increasing capital adequacy requirements in Basel III, one of the things that the banking industry said was, if you increase these capital standards by even a few percent, from 6 to 8% or something of Tier 1 capital requirements, it's going to have such a negative impact on bank lending that it would be hugely deflationary and cause a recession. If that's true, then if single payer is going to be so inflationary, we have a deflationary tool right there where the only actors that are going to be upset about it are the casino that would have liked to have got a loan. So if your heart is with the casino industry and not the single payer industry, fine, let's have that public conversation, but at least it's being made clear. The other thing is that it draws a harder line between regulated and unregulated banking. I completely agree with Daniela. This isn't going to solve the problem of shadow money. It's still going to be there. But what it can potentially do is suck up some of that energy and suck up some of the space in which other people who don't necessarily want to play that cowboy game and would rather engage in sort of more basic services can have access to it. And lastly, it peels back the veil of money in banking in a way that was going to have a very new public conversation. And that's going to be scary, and that's going to require thinking about how to sell this to the public, how to frame it, and how to do it. But I think the time is right, because every man and his dog has heard of Bitcoin now. Right? Crypto, whatever this, crypto that, it's hot, and it allows us to start a conversation that people will otherwise not be willing to have once you add the word tech to it. Thanks.
Thank you. What do I use to move this? Cool. I'm actually going to talk directly after this, so I'll try to keep this fairly simple. But my talk after this is on like the war on cash and digital payment systems. So I wanted to avoid talking too much about it here. And so I was thought I'll just do some kind of like framing of the financial technology sector, and then maybe how that kind of beelines into the blockchain sector. Although I probably won't get through all of that in this amount of time. This is my book that I wrote. This is my email address and Twitter profile. I work for lots of different organizations. Well, I don't really work for any organization actually. I sort of collaborate with lots of different organizations. I think on the program I'm technically under the Finance Innovation Lab, but I don't really necessarily always do stuff with the Finance Innovation Lab. Anyway, there's lots of different ones. So I thought I was going to start from this. I spent time with the fintech sector sometimes. In London, there's a big sort of financial technology crew there. This is a very crude diagram of banking. I'm sure you guys probably find this way too crude, but basically it's useful to at least frame the fintech debate to some extent. The idea that essentially you've got this kind of cartel of banks that have database systems, and then there's a central bank, and people interact with those systems. And money in the system moves essentially through the editing of databases. And then you can talk about credit creation and stuff in those bank databases, and all the stuff that Rohan's talking about. But the financial technology sector essentially is underpinned by this. All right? They try to build stuff on top of it, or in between it, or like try to create new layers around it in certain ways. But essentially that's what the financial technology sector is mostly about. There's often a lot of talking in the fintech scene about saying how they're disrupting the banks and like making them redundant and so on. And if you always look about it, it always ends up back in the banking sector, most of the things they're doing, right? There are certain ways they actually can disrupt the banking sector, but it's often for reasons other than what they say. This is just a diagram of this picture, but how this is often experienced by people in the world is quite different. I'm not sure if you can see this. This is a photo of the Commerzbank Tower in Frankfurt that I took, and then that's from outside the tower. And this is from inside the tower. This is the urinals in Commerce Bank. And it's quite a good illustration of the basic power dynamic in the financial sector. If you're on the outside, you perceive it as this giant sort of monolithic weird thing that you have to interact with via set sort of standard rule systems and interfaces. If you're on the inside, you kind of like look down on the world and you have to like abstract everything because there's too much stuff out there for you to deal with, so you have to use models and so on. And you know, this in some ways, you could, you know, people who are arguing for bringing finance out to a smaller scale, this is often one of the kind of things they'll focus on. But the fintech sector actually is plugging into this. Often they're trying to say, okay, we'll just figure out new ways for you to either make the internal processes, so the financial professionals, either going to try and like automate the people inside the buildings, or else we're going to try to essentially automate the way that you interact with those people from the outside. Those are the two big fintech categories for me, at least. And this is a bit crude, but so this is the future according to fintech. And I do like fintech. I'm just trying to like put it a little bit in its place. So fintech 1, this is like all the innovation, is essentially automate the user experience layer, aka automate the way that you communicate with these organizations or interact with them in some kind of way. These are a variety of ways that you can interact with the banks, and you know, you can go to the branch and those guys will plug in some stuff into the computer which will for you, so they're kind of like a human interface. All these various other ways. I mean, the ATM network's going to be slightly different, but like these are ways you can kind of touch the sector, as it were. Fintech is basically saying just get rid of those ones there, and make a proliferation of these various ones here. Okay, so essentially it's actually about reducing options, but like then within the narrowed frame of options, like making loads of different versions of the same thing. So you might have like 15 different payments apps, but essentially they all end up in the same place. Or else you add new layers on top of it. And so like a lot of the kind of these like platform banks or bank API systems, which are about like providing, you know, some intermediary way by which you can access the system. In this thing, you actually can have quite interesting stuff that happens in this, because you can have, for example, banks losing the customer relationship that they've traditionally had before and giving it up to some third party who then sort of channels it to them as a kind of like background player. So that is potentially of interest to disruptive banks in a certain sense, but in the end, they're still kind of part of the same complex. I'm going to speak about this next in the lunchtime session. So, but this whole war on cash is one part of the story. Okay, so basically getting rid of the cash system to basically push people into the digital ecosystem. So I'm not going to really talk about it now. But other parts of the story include getting rid of the physical branches and replacing them essentially with interface systems that you control. And you're really seeing in branches this kind of like hybridization approach is occurring, where you sort of have half human, half like self-service type processes going on. And there's a bunch of these kind of fintech startups which all talk about how the impending death of the physical bank branch. These guys are German, you know, and they always make these proclamations about the future, which are basically things that they want to happen, presented as things that will inevitably will happen, which is like a really good way of marketing. You kind of like make people feel stupid for not seeing the obvious type of thing that's supposed to happen. So it says, you know, banking as we know it today is dead. Your bank branch will not exist, and it's basically saying, you know, we do not want it to exist. So you know, this is what's going on there. And one of the big elements of this, and this is not unique to the financial sector. This is unique to this is you know, you find this in all corporations. The desire to drive to replace service with self-service. All right, so you essentially your service layers involve having to hire lots of people who are unpredictable or cost a lot and so on. So you want to get rid of them and replace them with self-service because in the long term that's cheaper. I mean, this doesn't necessarily always hold, but this is basically a general trend in a capitalist system. And in the short term, you will always present these new sort of self-service options as being cool and like catchy and awesome and efficient and modern and so on. But in the long term, you'll basically force people to use them. All right? They sort of cease to be options after a while, and then you basically have to use them. All right? So this is the way that this process kind of goes on. And so I use these self-checkout counters at supermarkets to illustrate this, because supermarkets will basically install these and then use these as an excuse to fire their front office, their cashiers. All right? After a while, basically phase them out and basically train you to use these systems. And And interestingly, if you look back in these kind of like banking history, you see these Barclays Bank making these claims in the like 1970s about we'll never have any robots at the counter. You know, we'll always have these human beings who interact with you in various ways. Because I guess at some point that this was a sort of concern. Are we going to lose the human connection? Of course, Barclays right now is at the forefront of trying to push digital banking. So this is like definitely a thing of the past for them. I actually found this in some like old photo archive somewhere. I think Barclays doesn't want it to be seen. But this process of essentially replacing service with self-service is going on all over the place, and a big part of it is about interface design, right? So this, all these so-called AI chatbots are basically glorified interfaces that sort of pretend to be humans. So a traditional interface is basically like a static system with a menu and you kind of interact with it. These systems are saying, okay, let's try that feels inhuman to people when they're interacting with these things. Let's replace it with some AI system that does natural language processing so it kind of can understand what you're saying and convert it. It's kind of like an automated FAQ system, right? And so this is one of the London-based startups doing this. Okay, the second part of fintech. So that was the first section, basically trying to automate the user experience there. The second major part of fintech is automate the financial professionals, who are the ones who are going to be interacted with. I don't have time to necessarily go into this in much detail, but there's a whole bunch of startups here that have been trying to do stuff. This is Wealthfront, who's trying to automate financial advice, as it were. And one thing about this you can say, this often comes under the guise of democratization of finance. A lot of these companies use that rhetoric, and the main claim that they're making is that this reduces the cost. A traditional financial advisor would have been more expensive than an automated system that can operate at scale, and therefore you're opening these services up to people who previously might have been excluded. And that is kind of true. And actually, I think there's some legitimate claim to be made. But in general, the main, I would say, main push going on here, again, is corporate cost cutting. But in the meantime, it may expand services to people. And one of the big pushes in financial inclusion is essentially about this. Replace people with technology, and then maybe it'll be more profitable for banks to deal with low-income people who are generally low profitability. This is one of my cynical comments that I make sometimes. This is essentially the fintech sector for me. It's basically a way to essentially speed up and automate and increase the convenience of an otherwise toxic financial system. Just make it easier to interact with. And interestingly, when I put this out, loads of financial technology professionals disagree with me and say, yeah, this is basically exactly what fintech is. There's never any real pushback about this. There's never any claim in financial technology circles that there's any kind of actual attempt to reform the financial system in any real way. It's just like, make it easier to interact with. Just to quickly, I don't want to go for too much longer, but I want to get to the blockchain stuff. How much longer do I have?
You have just under 10 minutes.
But I have to also get to the next one. Anyway, this is level 39, which is one of the big fintech hubs in London. And you can see, I don't know how I can read this, but it says, and on this side, I've got at the bottom, fintech is outsourced bank R&D. This is very widely accepted in the financial technology industry that this is basically what the fintech industry is. You outsource your research and development to an external group of startups, and then you slowly sort of suck them in or tack them onto your businesses. But the fintech, the level 39, it started off with looking at finance. Then obviously cybersecurity comes naturally afterwards. If you're digitizing everything, you're exposing people to a whole lot of new risks. So you have to then have a big cybersecurity push. Like, how are you going to make these new systems secure? But interestingly, you see they also go into retail and smart city technology businesses. And this is one of the sort of third kind of pushes, I would say, in the fintech world, is fusing it with non-human agents and IoT. So essentially, how do you make a robotic systems work? You have to integrate them with financial payment systems and financial systems. And you have to kind of make it all into one seamless process. Okay, so I have like a slightly obscure series of slides that follows this that I'll try to go through quite quickly. I mean, like if you look at robotic systems, they essentially have these. This is my way I think about robots. You have like some kind of machine that uses fossil fuel energy probably, and it kind of can sense things. And then it can process it through some kind of algorithmic mind, and then it moves its body around in response. Okay, so it has a certain set of responses to inputs from its environment. Okay, and then it can kind of do things. This is a Roomba. It will send out little infrared beams and work out how to suck, clean your carpets. But you can expand these systems beyond single objects. You can design entirely sort of robotic systems where these systems are separated into different parts. In this one, this is a closed system. My general argument is a lot of corporations are starting to essentially become like robots that are spread out over many different players and many different machines. So I'm just going to go through this basic trajectory of the internet of inputs and outputs. This is a traditional computer. You input stuff via the keyboard, and it will output stuff via the screen. This is kind of a robotic type system. But then you can expand these systems using the internet, where you can essentially start to link these machines together. You've got inputs going there and outputs to another computer, and then it outputs back to the original computer, and this all goes through telecommunications channels. What we've seen actually happening in the internet, though, is that this helps create giant network effects, and you start to get huge sort of centralized nodes upon the internet that everybody else interacts with. And increasingly, you could use other types of devices as well, your phones. Your sort of phase 4 of these is that you can start to actually have non-human agents that are interacting. So for example, right now your phone is sending location data. You yourself aren't actually doing that right now. Your phone is doing it for you. It's a non-human agent interacting with this system.
Sorry. Oh, sorry.
What happened then? Oh well, whatever.
Yeah, so much for machines, huh?
The output has failed. The output has failed. Okay, anyway. The basic point is that you essentially will... You can start to essentially design systems that do not require human input. And actually, if you start to think about it, a lot of corporations are starting to behave in this kind of way. So you'll get these, I personally term, algo-robotic corporations or algo-robotic systems, which are essentially giant sort of sprawled out corporations that behave like robots. And Uber is a pretty good example of this. It's taking in data from your devices, processing it through a giant algorithmic mind, and then controlling a bunch of drivers who will then go and act upon the will of the algorithm. And is that coming through? Did I push something here?
You said it might have overheated.
It's overheated.
It's overheated.
Oh, it's overheated.
Overheated.
The sensor
Okay.
noticed that it was too
Okay, well, let me
overheated.
just, if I can see the slides, they're really useful.
Censorship.
Yeah. I'll just come over here. I'll only be like 3 more minutes anyway. Algo-robotic systems. Anyway, you find these giant scrolling systems. And I'm going to try beeline from here into the blockchain scene, because what's going to happen is these guys are trying to essentially fuse together payments infrastructures with these algo-robotic systems. So you can have giant kind of automated payments. So you can kind of imagine these sci-fi scenarios of drones that are flying past your house, communicates with your fridge, tries to buy something, automatically triggers to a payment system, and all this is done without any input of a human agent. Okay, so the fintech startups are trying to work on that kind of thing. And what's essentially happening is you're not only automating production systems, but you're also automating management, logistics, and actually the process of exchange, deciding if you're going to exchange. That's almost the last frontier. People still have to push the button when they want to exchange. All right. A lot of what these guys want to do is just automate the decision-making process of the exchange. So that drone is making the decision or the fridge is making the decision. In this context, you suddenly find hacker culture and the blockchain scene, who is saying these types of things are becoming terrifying. Right? This is what a lot of people, the traditional internet-based hacker cultures have always been saying. This is going to create extreme centralization, extreme pools of data, extreme ability to manipulate large numbers of people from single groups of the people who control these infrastructures. So this is kind of almost like the historical situation that the blockchain community comes from. I won't go into it much now, but the original sort of thing the blockchain community was working on is how do you attempt to decentralize the payments system, and essentially that involves trying to replace the central intermediaries with a decentralized, or a protocol that enables a giant network of strangers to interact with each other. Because the key sort of problem people are working on in the blockchain systems is how do you get a whole range of strangers who do not know each other to interact, all right, and keep track of each other's positions. Traditionally, that role has always involved a central intermediary, all right? So the blockchain protocols have been working on how do you do that without the central intermediary, and so basically it involves replacing central intermediaries with some kind of technological leviathan, as it were, some kind of thing that intermediates these relationships. I have a lot of critiques of blockchain technology. I do not romanticize it at all, but it's worth seeing it in this context of this broader automation of management systems and automation of corporate structures. I might just end there because we could go into...
And we should, we want to leave some time for questions and discussion. I know
Sure.
Run, but
Yeah.
Great job by our last panelist with a lot of technological issues, actually.
Classic on the technology panels, right?
Exactly. Right. Okay, well, we're going to open up to questions. I wanted to do one quick thing. Carlos had asked me a few questions starting out. So, bravo for, as Rohan said, doing some thinking on your own and then coming up with a concept that, was heavily across the political spectrum, thought about to the point where high school friends would text me, what about this coin thing? So just my response is, and this is not obviously representing the department or my colleagues, but just the thinking that was going on at the time, and I'm sure at much higher levels there's all kinds of things going on, was that what we just wanted them to do was raise the debt ceiling. Like, at the end of the day, that had been working since the early part of the 20th century, so just raise it. And what I don't believe anyone really wanted to do was have a bunch from what the legislative branch's view was, a bunch of technocrats come in there and try to do something that they felt would usurp their legislative priorities. So the right answer we thought at the time was just raise the debt ceiling, and we need to convince you to raise the debt ceiling. And then ideally one day we won't need this debt ceiling because it's an anachronism from a very different time, and it's an output of your budgetary decisions you've already made. So do that, and we'll be fine. And we'll keep doing what we need to do. The second thing is that, and I want to be the reason why you stated that a lot of this rethinking wasn't taking place was because of the anchor of Wall Street to the various secretaries at the time. So I think I actually fully don't believe that to be the case. I think at the time, it was 2011, was the first debt ceiling. It was a very uncertain time in the world. We had just come 2 to 3 years away from crisis. Europe was going through its own funding crisis at that time. It did not seem like a great time to rethink everything. And I know maybe sometimes those are you don't have the breathing room, the policy room, the political capital to do that. So really, what we just wanted was them to raise the debt ceiling. So that's my response to that. But thank you for all your insights.
Yeah, and I want to say, I know that the Treasury.
The mic so we have
Yeah, and I know the Treasury and even the Reserve are some very smart people, and the ones I'm communicating with they're really on the ball. So when I said about above your pay grade, it's not the Treasury staff I'm saying, I know y'all work with the Treasury. It's at the level of people who
could be doing shock doctrine, right?
Yeah. at the level of people who should have acted, I just think that they thought that this has never happened before and it's not going to happen. So, and I think that's what the opposition was counting on. It's like they're going to be deer in the headlights and they're not going to move. But that, and it seems like towards the end of the administration, I think they sort of wised up that we're not even going to negotiate this, and Congress backed down. So that was some progress.
We should definitely look. We had such a rich panelist.
I'll probably go in like a few minutes.
So any questions for Brett?
Save your questions for Brett for lunch, but we'll stay here together.
I'm planning to be so don't worry about asking me.
Maybe you can take 3 at a time, something?
Well, let's start really quickly in the back with Raul.
Sure, so this is for Brett, but also for the whole panel.
I'll repeat the question so that...
So this is wonderful. I don't know what we're doing. We're not talking about a lot of this in the different years. And I know that I've seen you tweet about this a little bit, Brett, but I kind of want to hear a full response. So I deal with a lot of this like on the ground level. I represent low-income clients, a lot of whom have like online payday loans. But a problem that we see is that a lot of the law enforcement in this area, especially around anti-terrorism regulation, around money laundering regulation, actually doesn't bear down upon supposed criminal actors. It comes and it screws poor people. So I'm wondering what is, especially if they're sending payments overseas, if they're immigrant families, that sort of thing, what do you think the proper role of law enforcement is? And I know this is a big question, but what do you think is the proper way to screen for harmful activities while still allowing people access to the payment system?
Just to repeat so that people hear, it's what's the proper role of law enforcement in screening for harmful activities in the payment system sphere?
I mean, I think you probably know more than I do actually as an answer to that question if you're dealing with that. But certainly, in general, a lot of these large sweeping regulations end up screwing up all sorts of people who are not directly involved. I mean, the international correspondent banking system is one of the classic things with this, with like the so-called de-risking processes, where it's actually not worth banks a while to deal with certain types of countries or particular institutions, so they just cut lines. Correspondent banking lines with them, and end up, for example, people can't transmit remittances as a result, and there's all types of problems emerge. I actually do not know what the correct response to that is, but certainly I know, for example, the IMF is kind of like concerned by this type of thing because they're sitting in the middle of these types of different, essentially, objectives, which is on one hand, with all this anti-terrorist stuff, all these types of things that you have to pay lip service to, or you have to at least be trying to do something, whilst also maintaining the sort of the flows of the international financial system. So that's not a full answer, but it tends to fall on people who have it sort of punishes people who are not really directly involved in anything criminal or negative at all.
Oh, up front, you asked.
I think it's off. You want me to
Oh, yeah. But go ahead.
I'm a little troubled on this repo stuff by the idea that, because private actors want to create credit and create money for themselves and trade among themselves, that the government has to backstop it, even when the government is putting limits on it, because there's not really enough limits. And I think on the repo thing, you get this nice three-party repo, and then the Fed comes in with a reverse repo and guarantees it, and that's what's going on. But what about rehab application? We've got limits in the United States. Now, you tell me, are there any limits in London, or are they still discussing it? This stuff was repoed 4 times in London. You know that. When Lehman went down, nobody knew who owned what or where the collateral had gone. Hedge funds owned stuff. It was in a margin account. It went to London because your margin account agreement says it could go to London, and it got repoed all over the place.
So I'll pass this to Daniela because I mean, obviously a question about rehab application of what's sort of been the protocols that have been in place post-financial crisis about the rehab application.
We thought about that because the other thing you got to think about with Brexit is London is sort of doing whatever they want. Come here, we got less limits.
So you tie into Brexit, but also it's an interesting point about what Manamon's saying would have said about the velocity of collateral. So all yours.
Okay, as somebody who lives in England, I don't think that Brexit can actually trigger the kind of worries that you have. So far, it seems a disaster. So maybe in the future it will get better, but for now, what it seems that the kind of processes that you worry about might be moving to Frankfurt, and then things will happen there. I think on the question of repos and why do we have these backstops, I think there are some trade-offs that historically we need to think about, in the sense that for the last 30 years, for a long time, but for the last 30 years in particular, we have had, both in the US and then other countries have learned from it, increasingly become dependent on organizing the government bond market around a repo market, right? So the idea is you can't have a well-functioning liquid government bond market if you don't have a repo market that is more or less, was until 2008, designed completely by the rules of the architecture was designed by private repo market participants. There were some moments when things went wrong. For example, Salomon Brothers did try to manipulate the US Treasury market in 1991, but without, and particularly using the link between the Treasury market and the repo market, but there weren't any significant consequences. The Treasury and the Fed actually helped improve or remove the possibility for cornering the market. And to me, this is something that we still haven't been able to work out. And maybe MMT is a way of thinking about this kind of trade-offs, because what we see now everywhere, and I'm looking at China, where there is a great amount of pressure coming from asset managers based here and in London to liberalize the repo market so China can attract more foreign investors. And as long as we don't have a clear response to how do you get liquid markets without a repo market that is not very free, I don't know where we can go. To me, either we have a radical reform of the system, or we just have to accept that we are providing very significant backstops for private market activity that it's very difficult to regulate. So I don't think there is an answer except to say, well, we just don't want financial systems to be organized around securities markets. We just have to go back to traditional boring banking. The political will for that to happen, to me, seems around zero, but maybe it will change.
Yeah.
It worked.
It seems to just be turning itself off. Well, anyway, whatever. I'm just trying to get it for the record so that it's portable. Anyway, yeah, I mean, I think, obviously, I don't think the idea here is to be apologetic for, socializing private risk as the concept. But from my perspective, as a lawyer, and there are other lawyers here, so if you disagree, correct me, but I think there is a tendency of non-lawyers to think of passing laws sort of like a kind of magical button where you just pass a law and then something happens. So I think of it as a quite weak mode of social control. And its beauty is in its weakness. But it's not a system where you can just say, I don't like this thing, I'm going to pass a law and now it doesn't exist. So I think of shadow banking regulation, the metaphor that I use is sort of like kids who want to drink, to party. If you say, no, you can never drink, they'll just go out the window when you're asleep and go to the park. And that's dangerous, and the next thing you know, you're getting called by the police at 2 in the morning. Some parents say, drink in my house, do it under my supervision. And then you're like, you're a parent who's encouraging drinking. What the hell's wrong with you, you negligent person, right? And if you think of it like that, then yeah, sure, they're the parents encouraging drinking. On the other hand, they're also the parent that isn't letting their kid go down to the park and have the police call at 2 in the morning. So this isn't really that sort of cutesy metaphor. There was a thing called prohibition in this country. It didn't really work very well. Right? There are certain kinds of legal regulations that are not consistent with human behavior and don't work. And thinking about how to have smartly designed laws and to deal with the public pressure that is causing this phenomenon to come up is a matter of being careful with what you're trying to achieve and also being appreciative of the underlying impetus for this activity. So as Daniela said, if the problem is we have a scarce liquidity in the system and we're not creating public financial systems, my proposal was, let's do those things. Let's provide unlimited liquidity. Let's make explicit these public nature of these banks, and let's take as much of that energy that's currently being pushed into these new financial innovations and redirect it.
Yeah, so I guess my question was, so is it a question of lack of political will or lack of political ability? I mean, if North Korea got into the repo market, I imagine Treasury would shut it down tomorrow. I mean, it's a matter of it's seen as a positive.
Yeah, so to correct, I don't mean that I think repos are inevitable. I mean, I think that the tendency to engage in these forms of private satisfaction of private desires in the absence of a public alternative that can satisfy that tendency is a natural dynamic in legal systems in general. So I think, yes, you can address this problem. One way is to just crush people. Yeah? One way is to just break people and have prohibition and put enough people in jail. If you just kill everybody that's ever thought alcohol was fun, you'll eventually have a dry society. You'll just have a lot of dead bodies in the corner.
Well, you don't have to kill bankers to stop a transaction. Block a transaction. I mean, it's...
But if you're talking about situations where private credit contracts eventually gain moneyness property and move that way up the hierarchy, blocking transactions of financial institutions isn't as draconian, but blocking individual credit transactions that end up gaining these moneyness properties does become draconian. You end up in a situation where people aren't able to engage in any form of private credit, or you end up allowing those forms of private credit that end up gaining shadow bank property.
Well, that's not a slippery slope up the cliff. I mean, there's still...
Well, it's both.
I just want to say that it's not also a question of sort of legal, so the willingness to create a new legal framework, but I think there is also a broader question. If you look at the demand side accounts of why we have shadow banking and shadow money, and that's much more clear in Europe than here, it comes from the constant erosion, erosion of the welfare state, right? Because what you have on the demand side, you have institutional cash pools that are my pension fund, your insurance company that need repos in order to do what the bank deposit would do for myself as an individual. Now, the way to solve this is not to ban repos, but to nationalize all forms of what we used to have before as collective public provision for future uncertainties that now are done through markets. So the moment you don't have private pension funds or even public pension funds, the moment that the state takes on directly on its balance sheet the responsibility of providing for future uncertainties, you have the overall design of the monetary system changing completely.
Yeah.
Now, in UK, I don't know, I'm afraid to say that publicly because well, who wants to nationalize pension funds except Eastern Europe, Eastern Europeans?
I want to nationalize pension funds.
Yeah.
I'm with you.
Can contribute, I think, in the sense that, well, shadow banking is a manifestation of growing wealth inequalities and private provision for future uncertainties.
One more, and then in the back.
Can we get all three questions and then?
Yeah, sure. I wanna, yeah.
Putting aside for the moment the issue of asset markets, repos, lending, just talking about the mundane payment processing systems. I think the idea of all of us having Fed accounts is an obvious and brilliant idea where they do all the resolution every night. The way it works now is it works pretty well, and we've got basically two systems, the ACH system, automatic clearinghouse, and we've got the credit card companies. The ACH system works okay, but it's incredibly archaic. I mean, have you noticed the ACH computers don't work on weekends, for instance? And then we have the credit card companies, which are really sort of a protection racket, which require merchants to pay 2 or 3% of their revenues in order to fund the credit card companies' zero-win marketing competition using points. So two questions. One, why in the hell is ACH so bad? Why could it be made there? Is there any way the credit card companies would allow us to go to a free public goods payment system and totally push them out?
Oh yeah, two more. Sorry.
Go ahead.
So I read an article a week or two ago, and I think the title was like Bait and Switch or something like that. And the point that it was making was that the central bank and government really there's no public purpose served by issuing an anonymous digital bearer instrument. And that if the government wants to offer privacy in the transaction system, then physical cash is the way to do that. And the frictions that paper cash has versus digital cash are a benefit, not a feature, a benefit, not a bug, because they would discourage crime and stuff like that. And I just want to know, how do you respond to that, Rohan, with your proposal?
Anyone else?
A lot of the conversation about the repo market, it's sort of, I think it's a valuable contribution, and I sort of struggle to wrap my head around all the details of this, but I guess looking at this from an MMT perspective, right? Don't you think that there's a little bit, knowing that you have some sympathy towards nationalization, don't you feel there's some maybe a little bit overexertion of effort towards protecting the existence of markets that are inherently unstable, even as those markets they provision goods right now, but in an ideal system, we wouldn't have to depend on those markets to provision all those goods. And so if those markets implode themselves, it sort of wouldn't be our problem, our being the public, right, the public purpose. And so that discipline in itself, would be helpful towards regulating at least a little bit the excesses of the repo market. I don't know if that makes sense, the question I'm asking.
Okay, so I guess just quick, the first question, which was the ACA and the credit card.
I mean, so that the white paper that I wrote a previous one on mobile finance in developing countries. It's now a working paper with Binzaga that you can check out. I got money from Visa for that. I wrote exactly what I wanted to write. They never said anything. I hope they don't realize that I'm trying to take them out. I mean, it's on the record now. But yeah, they're going to absolutely fight. They're absolutely going to fight tooth and nail, right? They're the enemy here. And there's a reason why everyone talks about the banks and you don't hear the credit card companies as enemy number one, because they've managed to stay behind the scenes. They're just making that sweet. Sorry, what did you say?
Credit card companies are banks.
Yeah, but what I mean is we don't think about the credit card technology layer as being the one where they've really kind of captured and set up the protection.
2% of household transactions.
Yeah, but you know, there are a lot of people that have realized that banks create money, and they're like, this is the kind of privatization thing. But it's the privatization of that global payments processing where the first racket starts up. And if we had a public payment system there, they wouldn't need to exist. And they are desperately not going to let anyone know that they're obsolete.
Well, they're not greedy. They don't want 50% of everything.
That's true. They're very reasonable. They're reasonable protection rackets. Yeah. But so, and when it comes to the ACH, I mean, the first thing is, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Never underestimate how lazy people who want to go home at 4:30 are. And the second thing is that the only people that are even more scared of technology than you or I are governments. They don't understand what the hell this stuff is about. So yeah, this stuff was working, and it's sort of old and rusty, but at least I'm getting my TV, you know, the black and white channel is turning on every day. God forbid I try to set up one of these home systems and end up not being able to watch my shows. So I think the beauty of the moment we're in right now is that the private markets have seen dollar signs in their eyes on this technology, and they're forcing this conversation whether they like it or not. So the Fed called 2014 the year of payments, whatever, where they sort of said, finally, I guess we'll take responsibility for managing this payment system we refused to take responsibility for so long. And now, you know, countries around the world are sort of going from central bank digital currency as a thing of the future to it's coming to, oh my God, it's here. Like, that's the conversation that's changed the last 3 years that I've been watching. Now, I come from Australia. We've had a public interbank payment system that retail people can use called FPOS. Canada has a similar one. Countries that, you know, have a little bit more sort of social responsiveness of their national government, shall we say, have started to go down these paths. We can do better, and we can cut the banks out even further. But it's happening now. In regards to this question about the anonymity of cash and like why isn't physical cash good enough? First of all, there are social media systems that do what Twitter and Facebook do, that don't take all of your data and build the stars' best database, right? We don't use them. Why? Because they're mildly less convenient, right? There was once upon a time where you had to beat and torture people to get them to tell you who your friends were and where you meet every week. Now we post that stuff to Mark Zuckerberg and he hands it over to whoever gives him a search warrant or puts pressure on him behind closed doors. Why? Because it's slightly more convenient. So if the choice is between preserving the anonymity of cash and having that be an incredibly inconvenient method for payments of anything relative to digital cash, and that's the only thing that we have to preserve the civil liberties of anonymity and privacy in our economic life in any respect. We don't want the government to know what I buy online with my girlfriend at 2 in the morning, right? If we don't want that kind of stuff to come up, we need to have a way that actually is going to meet people where they are. And cash is not sufficient. Not only that, but as Brett's about to talk, which we're probably cutting into, we should leave, there's a war on that right now. It's not simply a matter of fighting a rearguard action and saying cash is good enough. They're doing everything they can to make cash not good enough. And what we need is to make something that does everything that they do, but without the desire to screw you in the middle. And that requires being proactive and not just reactive and defensive about cash. And the other thing is, we live in a world that isn't the same as the world when cash was created. When cash was created, most of our interactions were face-to-face and interpersonal or people in our immediate geographic area. The kinds of economic transactions that we need to survive on a day-to-day basis require transactions across huge distances, and those kinds of transactions can't be achieved with cash. So if you're saying cash does everything, my answer is no, it doesn't.
Well, they're slowly killing it with inflation. My wife is here. We watch old movies, and you'll see people, they buy something with $1,000 bills, you know, and they haven't issued $1,000 bills to the public in 50 years.
Right.
And so there will never issue anything longer, anything bigger than $100. And
Ken Rogoff, who makes mistakes in everything he seems to do, has decided that the next thing that's important for public policy is to get rid of the $100 bill. Right? So we're not making it easier to use cash, we're making it harder to use cash. Sorry. Exactly, he doesn't go to the grocery store.
And he doesn't live in a, look, our transmission lines in New York are 70 years old, our electric transmission lines. We're supposed to have our little electronic card in our hands when the electricity goes down.
Well, I'm not saying get rid of cash. We absolutely need to preserve... No, I didn't. We absolutely need to preserve cash as well. All I'm saying is cash is insufficient as an anonymity-providing transaction medium. I am 100% with Brett. I told him to come to this conference to tell everyone how important the war against cash is and how MMT needs to be involved in that fight and not let this happen. Because it's no use having economic justice if we don't have civil liberties.
I think part of in the article was an assumption about where the value of anonymity is defensible and where it's not. So somewhere in there was, small payments between individuals, retail payments should be anonymous, and that's where physical cash actually works for that, but then like large overseas payments have no right to be anonymous, right? And so if you're creating a mechanism to make that anonymous, then the
Well,
public
if
purpose
you're
isn't
talking
there for
about
that.
if you're talking about helping fund the Arab Spring against the suppression of the government in that situation, then being able to send large transactions directly to protesters in Tehran Square is probably an important thing, actually. And the other thing about that is that those small dollar transactions still require technology that's sufficiently dumb to be able to do that. That was my point before. Cash itself doesn't discriminate whether you're trying to make a $10,000 purchase or a $5 purchase. The law does. And there are ways that we can impose legal regulatory layers on top of the technology. But if we build into cash the ability of the government at any point in time to turn it off, or we build into digital cash the ability to just turn it off when they don't like what you're doing, then you can guarantee they're going to come for those small dollar transactions as much as the big dollar transactions.